Ontario, Manitoba, the state of Minnesota, as well as the First Nations affected. So in terms of defining those protection zones, has there been consideration for situations like that where an international government could potentially be involved or have jurisdiction over some of that water and that territory?
Thanks for the question. In terms of what's embedded in the legislation itself, it does not consider international waters, including tributaries that may flow outside of Canada. It's within the confines of Canada's jurisdiction.
I appreciate that. As well, back to the definition of the water protection zone. My last round, we confirmed that the minister could theoretically make decisions on defining that zone without consent of the First Nation or a relevant province or territory. It does seem problematic to me that is the case. Is there as discussions or any desire on the part of the department to solidify that into a more specific agreement in terms of ensuring that there is consent from each of those three parties before such a zone could be defined?
Thanks for the question. I'm reading the consultation section which you're referring to, which is section 22.2. We're talking about the minister must consult with First Nation, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Just maybe to add that provision is really in a broader context of the bill. And so in that broader context is rights recognition that requires kind of a coordinated approach with provinces and First Nations. So there is a requirement of kind of agreement between those provinces and First Nations. So it just suggests reading them together.
I understand that broadly, but how is that requirement of consensus captured? Like, how is that defined or solidified? Because again, we're hearing, this is a perfect example, we're hearing that this bill has been co-developed and that there's broad support. However, my colleague from the NDP, as well as myself and others, have brought forward concerns that we've heard to the contrary of that. So how will that be actually defined and actually actioned in the way that it's intended to be? Because you're saying great things. I understand the sentiment, but the legislation seems to be contrary to that.
Appreciate the question and clarification. So agreements are one way to do it, where there would be signatories of the provinces as well as the First Nations that are impacted. But there are other ways too. So it is a coordinated approach, and we do want to leave space for First Nations as the rights holders with their own governance systems to ensure that those agreements are approached in a way that works for every party. But an agreement is an example of that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. And next up, we have Mr. Scarpleggia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd just like to tack on to what Mr. Melillo just asked in terms of questions. It's still not clear in my mind. Now, let's say that the federal government and the First Nations agree on the delineation of a protection zone. Even if they don't get the agreement of the province in question, can they nevertheless state what they believe the protection zone should be, even if the province is in disagreement or does not intend to act to protect the part of the zone that belongs to it? Would that be possible? You know, for example, were there a province or a territory that were saying no, well, would that be a kind of a pressure tactic? You can't force the province to protect the protection zone under its jurisdiction. However, here's a map of what the delineation would be for the protection zone to protect the health of the First Nations, and public pressure would force the province to act. Is that one possible solution? that might be possible under this legislation. I don't know if you get what I'm saying here, but
Absolutely, definitely appreciate the question. And it is aligned with the rights recognition components. So anything that would be on First Nation lands wouldn't necessarily need agreement of the province. However, we do recognize that water flows, and so those pathways for that coordination are also provided for to help ensure that. But a First Nation could pass a law on their First Nation lands recognizing that that water flows, mapping their intake of water and their distribution of water as well. Thank you.
OK, donc cette carte pourrait inclure.
so that mapping could include protection zones that fall under provincial jurisdiction then.
Yeah, as part of First Nations
Deuxième
planning.
question, on sait que le nœud du problème, là où
Just to follow up, we know that the crux of the issue is, and the problem in the past has been when it comes to the management of drinking water in a First Nation, often the issue is a lack of adequate funding to maintain the water systems. There's been underfunding over the years. There was a formula back in the day that wasn't ideal in the sense that it wasn't updated. How can this legislation, how will it ensure that there's adequate funding on the part of the federal government so that the drinking water system is properly maintained so that there's no funding shortfalls?
Thanks for the funding. There has been significant investment in the water space, including in operations, which was recognized by the Parliamentary Budget Officer a few years ago. But in terms of, as it relates to Bill C-61, the funding framework that we had talked about previously outlines a number of things that must be considered as part of that framework, including the operations and the actual costs and the operations and maintenance of systems. So it's considered in this bill under the financing section, as to our many other
a
things.
requirement that they
As
get all this right.
So the funding framework really kind of, in my mind, is one, this doesn't exist today. The consultation around what is the actual cost for a number of things that are itemized in this bill. So creating that funding framework is kind of item one. And then two, the minister's use and public reporting of that framework are also conditions of the proposed bill.
Ça va, Monsieur le Président, je crois que j'ai terminé.
Mr. Chair, I think I've finished. Oh, no, I did have another question. Now, is this bill and the Canadian Water Act, is there any relationship between the two? Do they dovetail with each other, or is there an overlap in some way?
The question. So they are complementary in nature, absolutely. So it is our kind of sister department, Environment and Climate Change Canada, that is responsible for modernization of that Canada Water Act. But ultimately, they both touch water, and they both have kind of agreement-making abilities. This bill before you is really focused on First Nations and First Nations drinking water on First Nation lands, but they are complementary in nature.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
And I'll just add as well that we did have officials from Environment and Climate Change Canada who are engaged on the Water Agency and the Water Act as part of the dialogue table that I referred to earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Scarpa.
Thank you, Mr. Scarpaleggio. And on that note, we'll turn to Mr. Lemire for 5 minutes. The floor is yours, sir. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to underscore the exceptional work of water operators in Indigenous communities, and I'd like to see a provision in the legislation to recognise the essential work that they do. We often take for granted the water that we drink. It's an invaluable resource. But just like with police services, if we talked about wastewater and water management as essential under Clause 3, would it ensure that the First Nations would get the service funded fairly and equitably vis-à-vis non-Indigenous run services?
Sorry, just so I understand the question. If the question is about recognition of the important work, I agree with you, that operators do. How do we entrench that recognition in terms of a funding commitment? Is that, just so I understand clearly?
Well, so that drinking water and wastewater treatment can be recognised as essential, and as a result, that there be adequate funding for those services.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think some of those provisions are enumerated in the funding commitment section, so I think they're covered, but open to views, absolutely. Thank you.
Est-ce que le projet de
Now, does the bill respond to all the remarks made on the 19th of April 2024 by the Special Rapporteur of Human Rights on Drinking Water, Mr. Pedro Arrojo Agudo, at the end of his visit in Ottawa on the 19th of April 2024? He was highly critical of Canada when it came to the First Nations. Will this bill respond to the international criticism that we've had to weather back home here in Canada?
Question. There is in the preamble of the bill, there is recognition and acknowledgement of the United Nations work in terms of the Special Rapporteur and his mandate. I will note, however, that the visit did occur after introduction of the bill in Parliament, so we didn't have the benefit of that direct input at that time, but there is reflection in the preamble.
l'article 2
Clause 2 of the bill defines First Nations lands as lands reserved for the First Nations. But what about ancestral rights that are claimed by a First Nation where a land title was confirmed by a court? Why should that distinction be made in a bill?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would just think for clarity in terms on the technical side, I understand what you're saying, and certainly we've heard that consistently. I would just say the parameters of this bill are clear, and they speak only to what are called Section 9124 lands, which are reserve lands for First Nations. So those are the parameters by which this law would apply.
au sujet
Now, on the issue of Section 39 on immunity, I'd like to ask you a question of the about the general provisions in light of the recent research on the impact of climate change and the way of living of Indigenous communities. What is the corporate responsibility in terms of pollution, the use of dangerous chemicals and other chemicals that may cause harm to individuals and their children? Is there an accountability mechanism set out in the legislation? Will the government will the buck stop with the government, or will Indigenous people be responsible to some extent?
Thank you for the question. I think in terms of this legislation fits in a fabric of laws that exist in current day Canada, and it fills a gap that we've talked about before in terms of a regulatory gap on reserve and recognition of rights. So it's about the alignment of those things. I think you're right. We all have as duties as Canadians to pass on water to future generations that is both clean and safe. I think one previous question was about enforceability. So First Nations could pass laws that create stricter measures and enforceable measures to protect the waters under their purview on and under their lands. That is a very opaque zone right now, and this legislation would knit that up.
dernière question.
Final question. Would it be possible from an economic development standpoint for First Nations that they can have transactions from nation to nation when it comes to water ownership? Could they export water, for example?
So this bill doesn't contemplate the export of water, and there is federal legislation deals with the bulk transport and export of water. But this bill does not address that.
Merci, Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Our last questioner for the round and for the day today. We'll be passing the mic over to Ms. Idlout for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. I do have a question regarding source water protection. I do have a concern because we all know that as First Nations, Indigenous people, we were trying to be eradicated. Before colonialism came, we ran our own systems. We ran our waters. We ran our, and then this was all taken from us. This was, I recognize this, but we need to give these back to the people, and that there needs to be more consultations regarding source water protection. My concern is, so for example, municipalities or provincial governments, like for example Ontario or the Manitoba government, if they don't want to let go of these of their jurisdiction regarding freshwater, how will this bill respect how to give back these jurisdictions to Indigenous communities? This is all part of reconciliation efforts. So.
Also acknowledge that this is a colonial tool in a colonial system, right? And so it will never be perfect in terms of acknowledging what you're raising here, right? It is, and we heard that very loud and clear as well through the consultation and engagement processes. And, the minister certainly has talked about it at length as well around this legacy and how it is embodied within a colonial system. That's part of why we worked very hard to break some of the traditional practices in government around the sharing of drafts, for example. That had not been done before, certainly in our department, in terms of sharing drafts online, sharing those in advance of a bill coming to Parliament, that those consultation drafts would be shared. And certainly that consultation and engagement will be ongoing. We've talked a little bit about some of the clauses where the minister must consult, must engage, must cooperate with nations in order to move this work forward. So I hope that helps to answer the question.
I do want to believe what you are saying. I want to believe, but however, I've been told that Bill C-61 was tabled. You were invited to by Chief Monias. They did tell you. They did request to the federal government that they wanted you to come to the Neskantiga community, and then for you to present to the community on this proposed legislation. You did not go to the community to consult with the people. We all know that Neskanka Nation has had to boil water for the last 28 years. And they invited you to their community. You did not go to their community. I do want to believe you, but if you haven't responded to Chief Monias, how can we believe you that you will be delivering these this, because we need to bring back source water protection to Indigenous jurisdictions.
To Neskantaga and not gone. I have not been invited and not gone. Our officials and the minister meet regularly with Chief Monias, and certainly we're we continue to be open to having discussions with any chief and any expert, any individual who wants to continue to have these conversations. Our team does meet on a very regular basis with Niskandiga around the water advisory, but also the connected issues within the community, because it is, it is a holistic approach that is needed there, and that the department has responded to, whether it's through the Trust the Taps and those types of initiatives with the community. But I'm not aware of an invitation that has not been responded to. Certainly, we'll go back and check with our officials and make sure that if there is any outstanding correspondence or invitations, that we respond immediately. Thank you.
Third and final panel today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for their testimony as we start the study of Bill C-61. And that will conclude this portion of the meeting. So we are going to go from public to in camera for the next part of the meeting, so we will briefly suspend.